My name is Jeff Valentine. I'm a professor at the University of Louisville. The interesting thing is if I were home, I would say Louisville, University of Louisville. But when I'm not home, I say Louisville in Kentucky. My background is as a social psychologist. That's where my academic training was. Most of the research I do is in the area of educational policy. And there was a time when I called myself an educational social psychologist, but really I kind of study things related to education in general. As Eamon mentioned, I have a lot of involvement in the Campbell collaboration. I am a former co-chair of the methods group, former editor of the methods group, current co-chair of the training group. I'm also involved in the Cochrane collaboration in something called the psychosocial, developmental, and Cariana, where's, anybody help me out? What's the name of my group? CDLPG. But you get the idea. It's sort of like social work writ large. So I'm a statistical editor in the Cochrane collaboration. Have co-edited the Handbook of Research Synthesis and Meta-Analysis, second edition. So if you're ever interested in picking that up, we would be appreciative. I'm also on the editorial board of something known as the journal known as Research Synthesis Methods. Some of the work actually that I'll be talking about later on today is published in there. And if you bug your librarian, they may pick that journal up for you. It's consistently good work. So let's see. I think that's enough for me. So let's talk about you for a little bit. How many folks here are thinking about but not currently working on a systematic review meta-analysis? Raise your hands. Thinking about but not currently working on. A little more than maybe 10 of 40. Okay, how many people are actually working on a systematic review and meta-analysis? Okay, a little bit larger portion there. How many people would not do a systematic review and meta-analysis if their lives depended on it? Yeah, so there's a few there in the back. Yeah. You know, the most common answer when you talk to somebody who just did their first systematic review, when you say, how did it go? They say, I will never do another one again. Because it's an awful amount of work. For me, at any given time, I have 3 going on at once in various stages. So it's what I like to do. And hopefully you'll see that here. So I promised a confession, even though it's Monday, not Sunday or Saturday. I promised a confession. The confession is this. I am here to do the problem formulation bit for this Campbell collaboration training. I've taught systematic reviewing and meta-analysis half a dozen times at my university. I've done dozens of workshops on systematic reviewing and meta-analysis. I have never, ever done problem formulation. And part of the issue is that the problems in meta-analysis, systematic reviewing and meta-analysis really is not very different from problem formulation of any other kind of empirical work. And so hopefully that's one of the questions that will come out. It really isn't all that different. But the fun part, and the part that I hope to intrigue you with today, is that in systematic reviewing and meta-analysis, you are to some extent forced to confront some issues, maybe in more depth than you would have to if you're just doing any old study. You know, when it comes to picking constructs, you know, when people go out and they do their own study, they kind of know what they want to measure, and they just have tools that they use, and they do it. It works a little bit differently in systematic reviewing and meta-analysis, and so I'll sort of walk you through that process today. The last logistics thing I will say before we get going is that if you have sort of questions, I know it's early in the morning, but if you have questions, you should probably hold those until this afternoon. Is this on? Is this on? So if you have questions, you should ask right away. Just raise your hand, and I will be happy to answer them. There are usually 2 kinds of questions, all right? There are questions of clarification and questions where you sort of want to extend. And if you want to extend, maybe you ought to hold on to that towards the end. If you have a clarifying question, please ask it immediately. With 40 people in the room, you know somebody else has that question. So we'll have time at the end. We also hope to have time for a little bit of an exercise where we come up and maybe discuss half a dozen or so potential questions for systematic review with the entire group. And the reason for that is that I'm convinced that part of the skill here is just hearing other people's ideas and getting feedback on those and having folks say, you know, that question is too big or maybe that question is too narrow. You might want to think about those things. Okay, so with that all as background, let's get moving. So I'm going to, just to give us some context, I'm going to start with just a brief overview of what systematic reviewing is all about. And then we'll spend some time on, the bulk of our time on problem formulation. And I want to really leave you with sort of three slightly more specific messages, with the global message being this really isn't very different from any other empirical work you've done. And those are, there's a distinction between broad and narrow questions, or there are different kinds of reviews involving broad and narrow questions. And so that's something that you have to think about. One way to think about formulating a question is using what you might call the PICOS criteria, and I'll define that a little bit later. And then you can ask yourself, do I have a good question? Or if you're reading somebody else's systematic review and saying, is this a good question? One rubric you can use is the sample rubric. And then hopefully, as I said at the end, we'll have time for a little exercise. Okay, so starting with the idea of what systematic reviews are. They are a form of research, and systematic reviews at an abstract level are the same, are composed of the same steps as any other kind of empirical research. The distinction here is that we are using secondary observations, so we're using data that somebody else has collected, and essentially studies are the unit of analysis in a systematic review, not necessarily people. But the basic steps are exactly the same, and I'll run through those very quickly, with the overall aim of minimizing bias and error in the review process. One of the shocking things that exists even to this day is that typically, more so in the past, but true today as well, people doing reviews were not subject to the same level of scientific rigor, scientific scrutiny, as people who did primary studies. And so one way to think about the entire movement of systematic reviews and meta-analysis is to bring that level of rigor and transparency that we apply to primary studies to our reviewing efforts. We're trying to minimize bias and error, but it's important to point out that systematic reviews are not immune to those problems. What we hope to do is minimize, not eliminate. We hope that if two different teams go out and they do a review on the same research question and come to different conclusions, that it will be easier to figure out why that happened if both of those teams used a systematic reviewing process than if both had used something more ad hoc. And actually, that has been demonstrated pretty well. So I mentioned a moment ago that the process of doing a systematic review really very similar to doing any other kind of research. This point was first made back in the 80s, and you can get a couple of references, including to an updated treatment on that. So when I say that it's pretty much the same as any other research question, well, what do you have to do? In any research, you have to formulate a problem, you have to collect data, you have to evaluate data, you have to, analyze those data, and then you have to present them. So at that level, a systematic review and meta-analysis is no different than any other kind of review. What becomes different is in how these are played out. So in problem formulation, there's a little bit more work usually having to do with clarifying the research question and then writing a protocol, and I'll talk a little bit more about the role, what a protocol is and what its role is in a moment. And one of the things that we're going to do in that process of clarifying and protocol writing is we're going to set explicit inclusion-exclusion criteria. So one of the things that should happen before a systematic review is undertaken is that there is an operational definition that governs what studies are included in the review and what studies are not included. An operational definition for what you're going to include. Next step, data collection. Every bit of research has to do that. In the research in the systematic review world, what we're doing instead of going out and surveying people is we are surveying studies. That's one nice way to think about a systematic review. And you'll probably get a better sense of this in Sandra Jo Wilson's session on coding. One way to think about a systematic review is that we're surveying studies. And so just like any other survey, you don't just go up to whoever you want and pose questions in whatever way you want and pose them in different ways to different people. You figure out what questions you want asked, you pilot test those questions, and then you go out and you ask the same question to a defined group of people in the same way all the time. So that's what our data collection looks like. So we're going to gather studies, and then we're going to code studies, which is another way of saying we're going to survey the studies. We then have to evaluate the data, which in the systematic review world often involves an assessment of study quality. And so, of course, that's not really a relevant issue in a single empirical study because presumably everybody knows what their strengths and weaknesses are. We then have to do data analysis, where we integrate the effects from the collected studies and interpret those results. So the session on meta-analysis will talk a lot about that. And then there's report preparation, and this really looks very similar to any other kind of work that you'll do. So let me stop there and just get an affirmation. Have I convinced you that at a useful level of abstraction, a systematic review and meta-analysis is really no different than any other kind of research you've ever done? Right? It's really very the same, very much the same. It's just when you drill down and look at the details, it turns out to be a little bit different. Even the hard things in systematic reviewing and meta-analysis will be familiar. So when you go to the meta-analysis workshop, the statistics are based on the analysis of variance and multiple regression, stuff that you've done before. Many of you have done anyway. And the statistics, most of the statistics for meta-analysis can be done in Excel. You don't necessarily want to do it in Excel, but the math is easy. It's easy enough to do in Excel. It's easy enough to sort of wrap your heads around. So in a lot of ways, this is just not very different from what would be required in any other kind of research. What is, I think, maybe a little bit different is that we probably have to think more in systematic reviewing about team composition, because we end up needing different skills and pretty high levels of skills. So you really want to have somebody with at least one person who knows the research area very well. So I call that substantive expertise. So if you're doing a review on mentoring, the last thing you want is to have nobody on your team that knows anything about mentoring. You need to have somebody who's a mentoring expert. You also need methodological expertise, statistical expertise. The methodological expertise is largely in systematic reviewing and meta-analysis, but also in terms of the primary studies to try to figure out what people did, which is not always clear. Statistical expertise in the meta-analytic part, but also in the primary study part. And then information retrieval expertise. And don't underestimate the last point, because it turns out that things are harder to find than you think they will be. The other thing, anybody control of purse strings in here? Any people hanging out? So these are expensive, is the thing to say about that. It's difficult to do a good systematic review on the cheap. They're very labor intensive. And part of that has to do with the way that the primary studies are housed in a variety of different places that are hard to get and then reported. The primary studies often tend to be reported in ways that make them more difficult to analyze. So they're labor intensive and they're cost intensive. So I have $50,000 to $150,000 plus, depending on the scope, complexity, and the number of studies. So they can be quite expensive to do. unless you have graduate students who are essentially free. Okay, so I mentioned the idea of a protocol earlier. Protocols are critical to doing a good job with a systematic review and meta-analysis. So basically what a protocol does for you is it outlines, it provides an operational plan for how you're going to approach every phase of the systematic review and meta-analysis. So who in the room has done or will do a dissertation? Or how about a master's thesis? But if you're doing master's thesis too, about 2/3 of us it look like. If you think about the level of operational detail that went into one of those documents, a dissertation, or will go into your dissertation, will go into your master's thesis, similar levels of detail in a protocol. So really, we want a very detailed plan about what's going to happen. And the main reason for that is to protect both our readers and ourselves from data-driven decisions. It's really, really easy for people to sort of make up reasons to do something that looks like it's going to produce a good outcome. Good being whatever the perspective of the reviewer is. Really easy. And sort of the pernicious thing is, pardon me, that people are explanation generation machines, right? We can't help but develop explanations for things. Albert Einstein said that the results of any experiment make sense once you know how it turned out, right? And that's because humans can make up these stories really easily. And I'll diverge now and tell you one of my favorite stories from social psychology is that you can take a bunch of undergraduates into a lab and give them a bogus test of something like creativity and say, randomly assign them to say either you scored high or you scored low. So let me just back up and say that creativity is kind of an ambiguous thing, right? And most of us don't really know where we are. Artists will have a really strong identity of being creative. Most other people will be somewhere in the middle. So you give them this bogus test and you say, oh, well, this test said that you are creative. Can you explain that? People have no problem doing it, right? The other people who got randomly assigned to the you are not creative part, so you tell them, this test said you're not creative. Can you explain that? Of course, they explain it very easily. People are explanation generation machines. And so one of the goals of a protocol is to protect us from that kind of post hoc exploration and reasoning. That's not to say, though, that a protocol has to be set in stone. Protocols don't have to be set in stone, but the best practice is to make as many of the decisions as you can ahead of time. Those that you have neglected, when you're writing things up, say, oops, I should have done this and I didn't, or we should have done this and we didn't. But this is what we're going to do. And you can also change. You know, we planned to do X, but instead we did Y, and this is the reason. So we're clear about the timing of the decision and the rationale for that decision. We let other people make up their own minds. So with the goal I mentioned earlier of increasing transparency, we have to do a lot of reporting about the stuff that we either are going to do at the protocol stage or we have done at the review stage. And there are systems to help people think about what these might look like. And I'll point you to Prisma as being one such system. You can, if you just type in Prisma and meta-analysis, it's the first thing that will come up. And I even think that Prisma works by itself if you do an internet search there. So it'll tell you all the things that are good to have reported in a systematic review. And then you can see ahead of time sort of what sort of expectations there are at the end. So just in terms of concluding thoughts with respect to the orientation to systematic reviews and meta-analysis, I'd like to include the note that says most of the work involved in conducting one of these reviews is not spent in statistical analysis. So just in case you think, well, I don't like statistics and so I can't do one of these reviews, that's not the case. You can certainly be a valued member of a team doing other kinds of work. Really, I think most of the work is involved in collecting and coding the data. And the last thing I'll say is that the contribution of the final product is dependent on all stages of the review and not just statistical analysis. So you can do really wonderful statistical analysis, but if you've done a lousy job of collecting your data, then it's not going to be a very good review. Okay, so stop there. Questions or comments or complaints? Is it too early for questions, comments, and complaints? Yes. Okay, so the question is, you hear lots of people using the term systematic review. Do I have a sort of a definition that's dependent on the kinds of studies or the quality of the studies or the documentation, something along those lines, that can be applied to all systematic reviews? Is that correct, basically? And I think that the answer is no. I would say that the term systematic review is probably meant to be generic. And in my view, anyway, it's probably meant to define a process, not a product. So the process is a systematic approach, a systematic and transparent approach to all phases of a literature review. So systematic and transparent approach to all phases of a literature review. So what do I mean by systematic? Well, you'll hear a lot about that today, but it involves things like developing a protocol so that many of the decisions that will be made during the review process, what gets included, what gets excluded, how the statistics will be handled, how the studies will be surveyed, are explicated in advance. That also leads to the transparent part, right? So we're going to be able to tell people what we did. And people will be able to see what we did. Let me make two more thoughts, and then I think I'll try to wrap it up. So going back to the systematic, I could, if I'm interested in mentoring, and that's going to be the example I use in a minute. If I'm interested in mentoring, I could go to my bookshelf and pull off the journals that I have there and flip through them and try to find studies on mentoring and only include those studies. But we wouldn't call that a systematic review because it's not a systematic approach to collecting the data. Okay, so we really need something much more thorough. And you'll see that that involves an electronic database search, but also things that are more broad, contacting people who might be doing this kind of work, searching for unpublished studies in government and foundation websites, and so on. So much more systematic take on that. The other thing I'll say about the transparency is that it used to be the case that when people were doing literature reviews, they would collect studies somehow in some unsystematic way, and they would essentially read their results and decide what they say, right? So they would just kind of do what I call this cognitive algebra. It's a term I borrow from social psychology. It's not a good thing. In the context of social psych, it's a descriptive term, and here it's pejorative. When people do cognitive algebra, they're looking at things and they're trying to make up their minds about what those things say. So they look at their 10 or 12 or 150 studies, and they say, well, there seems to be something here, or more likely they conclude more studies are needed or whatever. So that's not transparent. So a 5-minute answer to the 30-second question is it's a process. It's systematic and transparent. If it's not systematic and transparent in quotes, as transparent as possible, then we probably wouldn't call it a systematic review. The other thing I would say is you don't have to do a meta-analysis at the end of a systematic review. You can do a systematic review and come up with no studies, or maybe one study, or maybe two, and maybe you say with two, I don't want to do a meta-analysis. So there's not necessarily a linkage between systematic reviewing and meta-analysis. You can do a systematic review and then a terrible job with the analysis stage. You can do a meta-analysis without doing a systematic review. God help us if that happens, but that's sort of what I would say there. And there's another question here.
I guess the other term is like a research synthesis. And while I was thinking about that not always resulting in a meta-analysis.
Well, I use
systematic or transparent.
that's right. So it has to be systematic, transparent. And I'll just say I use the term research synthesis and systematic review as synonyms, even though synthesis does imply sort of some synthesizing. Yeah, that's right. What else? You're going to be afraid to ask any more questions, I think. Okay. So with problem formulation, let's get to sort of the meat here. This is what we're trying to do. We're going to try to answer those two primary questions. We want to know what the specific hypothesis of interest is in the review, and then we want to know what evidence is relevant to that question. So what is the specific question and what evidence is implied by the question? So a well-formulated problem will define the variables of interest. This is what I'm interested in, this is what I'm not interested in. And it will do so in a way that will allow us to distinguish between studies that are relevant to that question and studies that are not relevant to that question. And this is where I think the conceptually interesting part comes into play here. Because it turns out that almost any systematic review will sort of involve you potentially stretching the boundaries of things, concepts, as you think about them. Because it turns out that other people think about them in slightly different ways, and maybe they're kind of the same thing. My example for this is always after-school programs. So we did a couple of years ago a review of reviews of after-school programs. When I started thinking about what kind of literature I wanted to look for, the after-school program that I have in my head is the one that my son went to, right? So it was after school, but it was also on school grounds. It was taught by teachers and teachers' aides. There was academic content, and there was some sort of play and enrichment stuff, and it happened every day. Well, so what about an after-school program that occurs in a community center? Right? Is that if I'm doing a review of after-school programs, do I want to include this sort of activity in that? And that's something as a reviewer we got to make that choice. Had to think about, well, what makes this different from the stuff that goes on in school? Who's leading the program? Those are all, I think, always really interesting questions. And it's not always, it's clear that there's often not a right answer. So your job as a reviewer is just to be clear about the decision that you made and justify that decision as best you can. I'll point out now, got a couple slides coming up about scope and sort of the kinds of questions that can be asked. What I want to point out now is that the scope of a systematic review can be either broad or narrow, depending on what you want to do. And so this is another one of those questions. There's not a right answer to, typically. I have a preference, but that doesn't mean that it's right. There are different ways you can approach the question. So you can tailor a question in very narrow or specific terms. So I could say, as an example, the after-school programs I'm interested in are on the school grounds. They are led by teachers. Or I could broaden that question, and I could say, well, they could be any location after school, including private homes, and they can be led by anybody, including people who are not teachers. It turns out that different ways of formulating that problem are suited to doing different sorts of things. So narrow questions, or asking a very specific question, is suited for testing the effects of specific treatments. So in the Cochrane collaboration, we do a lot of very narrow reviews where we'll say, what's the effect of cognitive behavioral therapy for children who have been sexually abused. So a very specific sort of treatment on a very specific population. Broader questions turn out to be more useful for generating new knowledge. So academics tend to be often a little more interested in these broader reviews. So a couple of examples from Mark Lipsey's work would be identifying common elements of effective programs. Anybody, how many effective program lists exist in the United States? Is it in the thousands yet? It's some really large number. Surely these thousands of programs are not doing 1,000 different things. Surely they're doing similar things. And so if you phrase a question broadly enough, you might be able to answer some of those questions. You might be able to say things like, well, effective programs involve youth more rather than less. They involve parents rather than not involving parents. They tend to be systemic rather than isolated. And those are probably good things to know too. These are maybe a little less useful for specific funding decisions right now, but they do help us generalize a little bit better, I think. Another way that the scope of systematic reviews differs is that even though I talk about these things in terms of being reviews of interventions, they're not just limited to interventions. So we can address trends, or you can do epidemiology, or the accuracy of tests. And it's also not limited to quantitative studies. You can do a qualitative or a mixed methods synthesis also. So really these things can answer any kind of question that can be answered in an empirical way. So we can answer questions about the effects of interventions, including comparing one intervention to another. We can ask whether how things are related and whether that varies as a function of population. We can also look at, as I mentioned, sort of issues related to test accuracy. So any kind of question you can pose in a primary study way, you can pose in a systematic review and meta-analysis way. Anything. And I'll demonstrate that now. So I'm going to use some recent work on mentoring by Dave Dubois and colleagues. And the work I'm going to use is called, it's titled, How Effective Are Mentoring Programs for Youth? A Systematic Review of the Evidence. So I'm just going to walk you through the steps associated with figuring out what the right way to phrase the question is, using that study as an illustration. So we've got to do a couple things. And these essentially happen at the same time, and they're iterative in the sense that they inform one another. We have to determine the conceptual definitions that are relevant to the research, so sort of what we mean broadly by after-school program or mentoring in this case, and then we have to figure out what operational definitions we're going to use in the study. So we want to know what conceptual definitions we're interested in, what constructs we're interested in, if you're used to that Shadish, Cook, and Campbell way of talking about things, and then what operational definitions fit underneath that. And it's often good to think about problems in terms of what we call PICOS. So the populations, the interventions, the comparison group, the outcomes, and the study designs. So at the end, I'm going to need to be able to specify what population I'm interested in, since I'm doing a review of mentoring interventions, what interventions I'm interested in, what comparison group I'm interested in, what outcomes I'm interested in, and what specific study designs seem to fit my purpose. So again, going to the Shadish, Cook, and Campbell way of thinking about these things, it's important that the operational definitions fit their intended constructs, So we talk a lot about concept to operation fit. And this is a really interesting thing sometimes in systematic reviews. And I'll give an example of kinds of places that these issues will crop up. A lot of times we'll know exactly what we mean when we say certain things. But sometimes it's not, and it's when it's not that it turns out to be interesting. So it turns out that different fields may use different terminology to refer to the same thing. So people in nursing might use a different term than people in social work, who might use a different term from people in counseling psychology, talking about the same activity. And this has implications for your literature search, because typically we don't want to just find the counseling psychology stuff that's relevant. We want to find the nursing stuff and the social work stuff too. So we have to know a lot about how different fields talk about those things. It's also the case that different fields can use the same term to refer to different things. So you have to be really careful about the labels that are provided in the study. Hopefully, studies will also provide an operational definition. If the study says these students were at risk, they will tell you what at risk meant. If they say these students were low SES, they will tell you how they operationally defined low SES. Turns out that happens a lot less often than you would really hope. So here's one example from my own work where the same label was used to mean different things across fields. So we ran across a study that said, here we had an adult who was paired with 2 to 4 children, met 1 hour a week for 4 weeks, and they met in school. And the sessions focused on improving math achievement. This activity, those 4 things, was referred to as mentoring in this study. But I really think that's tutoring, right? And I think that most people would say, you know, this is what they were doing was tutoring, not mentoring. And you'll see later on that our definition of mentoring actually excludes some of these things here. So you have to be careful of those kinds of things. People will use terms in ways that are unexpected. And if you're not sort of alert to that problem, then you can end up including or excluding things that that really you should be doing something different with. Has anybody heard of the apples to oranges critique in systematic reviewing and meta-analysis? What is that? Somebody, a little audience participation. I saw your head shake, and so you get to tell them this.
Yeah, what I've seen is maybe it's different outcomes, people consider different things.
Okay. So generally the problem that the apples and oranges critique is people will say, well, you're putting together things that are really different from one another. And sometimes that in fact happens. But sometimes the critique is overblown. So you know, the concern is these things are different from one another, and so you should really keep them separate. It turns out that's a harder question probably to answer than we have time to deal with. But I will point out, as mentioned on the slide here, that really there is a parallel problem in every primary study. So any study you go out and do that's a quantitative study will probably compute a mean on the sample, right? So we have a single number that describes the distribution, the center of the distribution of a set of students or people or whatever. But that center may not describe any single member of the sample. So there may not be an average person. There probably isn't a perfectly average person, and yet we're all comfortable putting together studies, putting together these individual sample members and coming up with a mean. It really is kind of the same issue here. What we want to know is whether there are things that we know that are different. We know every person is different. We know that every study is different. No 2 studies have ever been done that are exactly the same. So we know that they're different, but the interesting question is whether they're similar enough to be combined. And so that's another thing that you have to be thinking about. Are these things similar enough to be combined? And so, as an example, with academic achievement, if I had one study that gave me the effects of an intervention on grade point average, and another that gave me the effects of that same intervention on standardized test scores, I would probably average those, right? You may not do that. But at the protocol stage, you're going to want to say, we will average grade point averages with one another. We will average standardized tests with one another. We're not going to put them together. And then you can argue about whether that's a good thing or not, right? But you as a reviewer get to decide what you're going to do there. I think they're tapping the same underlying construct, so I'm going to combine them. You're free to make a different decision. So what I want to do now is look at the title of that paper and figure out what we can fill in terms of the PICOS criteria. So the title is How Effective Are Mentoring Programs for Youth? A Systematic Review of the Evidence. So I've bolded a couple of things there. We know that participants are youth. We don't know what the operational definition is, but we know that the participants are youth, so at least generally we know what's going on. We know that the interventions are mentoring programs, but again, we're lacking an operational definition. We don't know what sort of comparison group we're talking about. The title didn't specify any outcomes, so we don't know what outcomes might be talked about. But we do know something that's implied about study design, right? It says effective, and so that suggests that these will be at least randomized experiments and perhaps something slightly broader than that. So some of the concepts of interest you can glean from the title here, but all of the operational definitions are missing. And so Dubois and colleagues had to go through and figure out what those were. And so if you had that paper, you could do this work. I'll just summarize it for you pretty quickly. So the population or the participants, the title says they're clearly interested in youth, and it turns out that if you look at the paper, they included studies of youth under the age of 19. That turns out to be close to an operational definition. It's not quite there, but it's close. The reason it's not quite is because we don't know what to do with samples that include 19 and 20-year-olds and the younger ones. And so Dubois and all had to make a decision about that. Was there a question in the back? No, there's not. Okay. Sorry. In terms of study design, I mentioned we probably want randomized experiments, and it turns out that Dubois and all included quasi-experiments as well. Now here's the interesting stuff. So I showed you the study that described what I would call tutoring as mentoring. In order to sort of figure out whether things fit or not, you have to have a good conceptual and operational definition of what you mean. So in terms of mentoring, the conceptual intervention, the conceptual definition that Dubois et al. Used was an ongoing positive relationship with an extrafamilial adult with or without specific instrumental goals. So it has to be ongoing, has to be an extrafamilial adult, and then specific instrumental goals like teaching math versus just some sort of broader youth well-being sort of outcome, doesn't matter. That was the conceptual definition. The more operational definition is youth are paired on a one-to-one basis with a volunteer from the community with the aim of cultivating a relationship that will foster the young person's positive development and well-being. So now we know more about what kinds of studies would be included, right? We know that if the adults are not volunteers, so if they're paid professionals, we're not going to include that study. We know that if there's more than one kid per adult, we're not going to include that study because we have to have one-to-one. And in this case, we know that if the study had an instrumental goal, teaching math as an example, then we wouldn't include that. What we're really interested in are studies sort of on the Big Brothers Big Sisters model where the goals are much broader related to positive youth development. Question?
How deep do you have to go for your operationally defining concepts? What is positive development, well-being?
So the question is, how deep do you have to go? And generally speaking, I would say you go as deep as you can, right? So if you look in Dubois et al.'s our paper, you'll see a definition of positive development and well-being, right? So we're talking about things that relate to just sort of general life satisfaction, self-esteem kinds of things, not specific goal, getting a job, improving achievement, etc. Staying out, even specific goal of staying away from the juvenile justice system. So like mentoring programs that involve diversion of kids who have just entered the juvenile justice system would be excluded from this sort of thing. Does that help? The other way I would answer that question is you always have to be aware that people will do things slightly differently in ways that sort of challenge the scope of your conception of an intervention. And you have to think about how far you can stretch it before it loses its integrity. And this is another place where you have to make that decision as a team rather than being a correct or an incorrect answer. Anything else? I think this is probably, in the kinds of work that I do, the most interesting question. What constitutes the intervention? Okay, so I said all of these things. I don't have to say that again. All right, so let's go back to PICOS. Just a few things to say about issues involving comparison groups. So we could do this in a lot of different ways. We could say, let's compare mentoring to other presumably effective interventions, like mentoring versus tutoring. Or we could we could compare mentoring to things that we think are probably not effective. Handing people some literature probably falls in that relatively ineffective range. So maybe those kinds of things could be included. It's often the case in social research that we'll end up comparing the effects of some intervention to usual treatment, so what they would have gotten anyway. And sometimes we can do no treatment conditions like a waitlist control. So you have to think about how you're going to do this as a reviewer. The one to be really careful of, I think, is the first one, because that's kind of a qualitatively different question than the other three. And the other three, you have variations on the theme of what would have happened anyway. If you randomly assign in a primary study some people to get mentoring and some people to get tutoring, then you have a different, that's a head-to-head comparison, is sort of a different thing. It's the effects of an intervention relative to some other intervention instead of the effects of intervention relative to probably what they would have gotten. So you have to be very careful here how you do this. For my own work, I would probably, in the mentoring things, include any of those bottom three, but not include the top one. At least not in the same meta-analysis. I might do them in a separate meta-analysis. Yes?
What is physiotherapy?
It's handing people a pamphlet. You see that mostly in parent training things. So some parents might get assigned to a group and others might get assigned to, they get a pamphlet that says, well, you might want to think about having a structured bedtime. Think about a specific place to do homework, those sorts of things. So it's just a presumably ineffective way of changing behavior. In terms of the outcomes that are examined in a review, we should use theoretical and practical considerations to help us figure out what we're interested in. So it's usually the case that you'll include in a systematic review outcomes that the intervention ought to impact. So you could argue that if an intervention is not supposed to impact academic achievement, you probably wouldn't measure that. Probably wouldn't do that in a systematic review. I probably would do it, but then you run up with the problem if the intervention's not supposed to impact it, most studies aren't going to measure it. So there's a sort of another problem there. But I'd say in most systematic reviews, what you end up with are outcomes that the intervention should impact, and then you have to have both conceptual and operational definitions, of course, for all of those outcomes. And again, the issue is going to come down to people will stretch your conception of what you think those outcomes are. So I have down here for operational definitions of grade point average of academic achievement, grade point average, achievement test scores, homework scores, project grades, graduations, 5 different ways that took me 15 seconds to come up with. And I guarantee you that with a little thought, I could come up with another 10, and with a good literature search, I could come up with another 15. Yes?
I'm wondering about adjusting adjusting outcomes that may be causally prior to one another, and how to handle that, because I'm dealing with a particular issue where the people putting together a review may not actually realize that some outcomes are prior to others, but still want to address them.
Okay, so how do you handle outcomes where there's sort of an implied causal model, basically? Those can be hard in sort of a basic meta-analysis framework, but you could maybe potentially do a meta-analytic path model as one example. So in my own work, I believe that that academic self-concept has an effect on later academic achievement, but I believe that effect operates largely through motivation. So my path model goes academic self-concept, let's do it this way, academic self-concept to motivation to academic achievement. And so you could do a path model if you have the right studies that sort of look at those relationships there. Does that help?
Yeah, actually specifically, this is sort of, you can take this as an example, and that graduation is going to occur after GPA.
Yeah.
So how do you put them all together? So I'm just wondering about how you actually handle putting them together.
Oh, okay. So the specific bits of putting them together. Well, so let me just make up a situation in which I would do that. So let's say that we are looking at an attendance policy in high school, right? So actually, probably for attendance policy, I wouldn't do that. Probably for attendance, I would keep it together, or keep them separate. Let me think about where I would put them together. Perhaps on homework, okay? So if I'm interested in homework, and my first shot is I want to know how homework affects achievement, and some measure GPA, and some measure test scores, and some do graduation. I would probably, at the very first level, put them all together. And then I would say, so this is the overall average effect. And then I would ask the question, does the effect differ depending on how academic achievement is measured? So then I would get separate effects and confidence intervals for grade point average, standardized achievement tests, and graduation. So that actually brings up a good point. When I say I'm going to put everything together, I should make it clear that that is ideally an initial stage. And ideally, later on, I will try to break those things out. Now, data limitations may prevent that. I may not have enough studies to do a fair comparison of whether the way that achievement is operationalized matters. But from the standpoint of my plan, that's what I would say I would do. Does that help? Okay. So just to let you know, if you recall from the title, in the mentoring study, we did not specify any outcomes, and it turns out that we were interested in a lot of different kinds of outcomes on students. And so we have there are probably 8 or 9 different meta-analyses reported in the systematic review, one for every kind of one of these broad constructs here, so attitude toward school, academic achievement, and so on. So one of the reasons we're doing this, I mentioned earlier, is that we want to have explicit operational inclusion-exclusion criteria. And it's often the case that the PICOS criteria will help us get to that point. So if a study is on at-risk students, then we know that our population is at-risk students. Now that we have hopefully a conceptual understanding of what an at-risk student is, we still have to operationally define that. So there's still work to do. But we know from the Dubois et al. Study, if we come across a qualitative study on mentoring, we're not going to include that, at least not in the meta-analysis. If we come across a study that uses a pre-test, post-test design, we're not going to use that. If we come up with a study that uses a quasi-experimental design where some kids get mentoring and some kids don't, then we're going to include that. And if it's a randomized experiment of the same type, we're going to include that. So the PICOS criteria will tell us a lot about the inclusion-exclusion criteria. They may not tell you everything. The other kinds of things that are often not included in a PICO statement are things like geographic and political boundaries. So if I'm studying the effects of homework, I will probably include United States and Canada. I might include the UK and I might include Australia. I might not include many more geographic entities than that, because I want places that have sort of similar schooling systems. So I have to figure out a way to justify that. And I'll leave the inclusion-exclusion criteria now and just say that Sandra Jo Wilson in the coding session will show you how to run down to do the screening on these inclusion and exclusion criteria. So just a couple of things before we wrap up. My preference in reviews is for relatively broad questions. And so you've seen that borne out in the examples that I give and in the Dubois et al. Review. But it's the case that this could very easily have been narrowed. So if your preference is for something narrower, there are lots of ways that this could have been done. So we could have limited mentoring to a specific program. There's nothing wrong with a review of Big Brothers Big Sisters programs. Nothing wrong with that at all. And that probably has its use. We thought we could generate more knowledge with a broader review. But you could do the Big Brothers Big Sisters review. We could have also compared mentoring to another intervention. So instead of saying how effective is mentoring relative to what these kids would have gotten in the absence of mentoring, we could have said how effective is mentoring relative to tutoring or counseling or something along those lines. And then in similar ways, we could have limited to a specific population, focused on particular outcomes, and so on. The point here is that there aren't, again, right answers to the questions. Your job as a reviewer is to decide what you're going to do and make your case. Your job as a reader of systematic reviews is to ask yourself the question, did these people make the case for being this broad or this narrow or whatever, and is it conceptually useful for me? In the new issue, I should have said there is a paper by Laurie Anderson and her colleagues that describe logic models and how logic models can be used to help formulate the problem. So you can find somebody else's logic model or develop your own, and they can help you figure out sort of how you want to broaden or narrow a systematic review. So to take an example from a Campbell collaboration review, this is Susan Zief et al. Looked at after-school programs, and they have a bigger model that I couldn't fit on a readable slide, but basically their model is that we have an intervention, and the things that matter are the specific activities that are done, how well it's implemented, what the resources are, what the staff characteristics are, and so on. And then they said, this intervention should lead to immediate change, and where you should see immediate change is in supervision and academic support in the extent of participation in enriching activities. And then we have intermediate outcomes, behavior, homework, television watching, attendance, sort of in that cluster, and then the socio-emotional things like safety and self-esteem, and then longer-term outcomes, grades, test scores, educational attainment. So you could, if you were thinking about doing a review of after-school programs, focus on the entire question as laid out in this logic model, or you could try to narrow it in some way. So you could pick a single longer-term outcome, or you could look at the socio-emotional outcomes in the intermediate box, and so on. It's also the case that logic models do a good job of helping us think about where to look for interventions that may be ineffective, right? And so if it turned out that Zief et al. Concluded that after-school programs were not effective, they may be able to look at the evidence in their studies and point to specific problems, like it turns out that there's not much academic support in these after-school programs, right? So if they code their studies and it turns out that only 10% do things related to academic support, then it probably is no surprise that there aren't any academic achievement outcomes at the end. So it can help you sort of diagnose those kinds of problems. And I'll bet. So I said all that. And then the last thing, the last acronym I'll give you guys is, so when we're thinking about whether or not we have a good research question, remember the PICOS criteria? P is for what? Population. What's I? Intervention. C? Comparison. O? And then what's the S, which we had, the study designs, right? So you want to hit as many of those as you can in your title, and you'll have to answer all of those to have a good research question. But then at the end, you can say to yourself, okay, is this a specific question? Is it answerable? And those are often tied into one another. If it's not specific, it's not going to be answerable. But sometimes you can have a specific question that's not answerable. Are there measurable constructs? Especially if you're doing work in the Campbell and the Cochrane collaborations. Is it practical? Is it logical? Do the relations make sense? And then is it empirical? So the sample criteria. And I'll say just one more thing really quickly when I see the pencils stop flying. So the last thing I'll say before there are questions relates to the idea of whether, when you're supposed to know if a question should be tackled by a systematic review. So I would say that as a general rule, if you set out to do a systematic review, the expectation is that you will find multiple studies, at least 2. But usually we think there are going to be maybe more than that. If a good review already exists, don't panic. You could update that review. Updating reviews is a worthy activity. It's also the case that you might be able to add something new to it by testing new relations, or you might be able to improve the methodology. So that's if a good review already exists. There's still good reasons to do a review. And if a state-of-the-art review does not exist, then you should go out and do it. And the last little thing I will leave you with is that even if you think there aren't any studies that will meet your inclusion criteria, it can sometimes be useful to do a systematic review because A, sometimes we'll find them, and B, it's fun to point out, in many cases, some widespread practice that's never been subject to a rigorous evaluation. And so there's a cottage industry in medicine of people going out and looking at what your doctor does on a daily basis. It's never, ever been subject to a review. And the percentages are shocking. Never been subject to even an experiment. So I'll just give you a number. So what would you guess, what percentage of your doctor's activities have been studied in an experimental design? 75% or higher, raise your hand. 50% or higher, raise your hand. 25% or higher, raise your hand. Yeah, we're getting close. Yeah, so estimates range from something like 15 to 25, maybe 30% of what your doctor does on a daily basis has been subject to at least one randomized experiment. So there are people pointing that out. And a colleague and I are doing a review of drug testing policies as a precondition for participating in high school activities. So if you're not from the U.S., a lot of times school districts will say if you want to play baseball, you want to play basketball, you have to do this drug test. We have really no idea if that's an effective thing or not. And virtually every school district has some sort of policy. Nobody knows if this leads kids to other drugs, or if it works, it leads them away from drugs or whatever. We just have no idea. So those things can be fun to do. Okay, so I will stop my part. What questions do you all have? Yes?
Can you give me a reference for someone who does meta-ethnography?
Meta-ethnography, I'm almost positive that on the slide, which will be available on the conference website, it will be there, but I can picture the book cover, but I'm not pulling out the title right now. Yes?
Is it Noblet in here?
What's that?
Noblet?
I don't know Noblet.
That's an old book.
Yeah. Yeah. Noblet.
Before when you were saying that the case study was dropped out, and the pre-post was dropped out, it was because the questioners are doubt effectiveness?
Correct.
Right? Now, can a case study, a very well theoretical case study, ever be included?
So the question is, can a high-quality case study ever be included in a systematic review and meta-analysis? The question is what you mean by include. So I strongly believe that those sorts of things, that sort of work, should inform the work of the systematic review and the meta-analysis. It's hard to take those results and use them in a way that informs the meta-analysis part, right? So we'll use qualitative research to tell us sort of what the important outcomes are, what the important processes might be, what the important barriers might be to try to code for those. But it's hard to take the results and use them in a meta-analysis. Yeah, thank you. Yes?
Is there a general rule of thumb for how many studies would be needed, like if you wanted to do the meta?
So the question is if there's a rule of thumb that says how many studies you need to do a meta-analysis. It turns out that Terry Piggott, who you'll see doing training sessions, and I have a paper called How Many Studies Do You Need? And the reason is we get that question all the time, so great question. And so the quick answer is 2. The longer answer is 1. If you're a Bayesian, you can do 1. Really, you need 2 studies to do an average. A meta-analysis with only 2 studies is going to have limited usefulness. There's a couple problems. One is statistically, you're going to have a wide confidence interval probably. The other is that most studies are not really comparable enough to say that mixing 2 together makes sense. But anywhere from 2 to some bigger number, and it really depends on sort of the context and how similar the studies are to one another to make that decision. Usually, people don't, if you did a systematic review and you said, well, I found 4 studies and I'm not going to meta-analyze those, people are not going to give you a hard time. What people will do, what I will give you a hard time is if you stand up and say, well, there were too few studies to do a meta-analysis, but overall they seem to suggest ... right? And that happens all the time. All the time. People say, I couldn't do meta-analysis, but overall they seem to suggest. That's a synthesis right there. And it's the pejorative cognitive algebra synthesis. It's going on in the person's head, not in some sort of transparent way. And so we want to avoid that. If you say, I only found 4 studies and I couldn't do a meta-analysis, or I found 12 and I couldn't do a meta-analysis, and you stop there, and maybe you put studies in a table and you describe those studies and what made them different from one another, most people would be perfectly fine with that. What else? Yeah?
The times, I'm assuming that if you have a series of empirical studies, the more recent ones take into account the older ones. Is there a cutoff point, or do you have to take them all into account?
So the question is, when you're doing a systematic review and you're setting your inclusion and exclusion criteria, how do you set an end point, or at what point are you going to not look at studies because they're too old, basically? And that's a very difficult question to answer. And in most cases, any way you answer it will be arbitrary. So that's the problem. The clean case is if there's a policy change that makes the old studies irrelevant to the new context, you can say, okay, I will do that. Welfare reform in the United States in 1996 made all of the welfare reform studies prior to that irrelevant, probably. So if I were doing a welfare reform study, I would probably look from 1996 or 1997 on. But in most cases, there's no non-arbitrary way to do that. Sandra, do you address this in your comment?
No. It's a good question, though. And it really depends on whether you think the interventions have changed in some significant way so that they become different and irrelevant to policy, or whether the research design studying those interventions have changed in some significant way, but the old designs really aren't going to answer the question in the same way. But it is, like Jeff says, kind of arbitrary, and it's sort of a matter of how you think the research is going to inform your question, how far back you go.
You know, I would say if you had, if you know, Sandra said if the intervention has changed so much, I think ideally, instead of setting a date, what you would do is you would code the important parts of the intervention, and you would say this has to be there, and that has to be there, and that has to be there, and if it's not, I'm not going to include it. And then what you would do by implication is you would kick out some of the older studies, presumably. So if you can do it directly, it's probably better to do it directly. Otherwise, I don't think there's an answer to the question. Yes?
I have a question about how you define then a qualitative systematic review. Let's say you did a question on academic achievement, and the studies have rather disparate outcomes, and so you don't want to do a meta-analysis. Then how do you do that synthesis in a more qualitative way?
So the question is, how do you do a qualitative synthesis of the qualitative studies? The way people do that tends not to be good, right? So I value a couple things. I value transparency, and I value consistency in the way that the decision rules are played out. If you just do it in your head, it's hard to get that transparency and the consistency. And then people will do things to make it more transparent, but they do so by adopting rules like vote counting, the statistical significance of the effects. And so they'll say, well, two studies said that the results were not statistically significant, and one said that they were statistically significant, so I'm going to say in my qualitative synthesis that it's not, that the intervention is ineffective. We know that vote counting is a bad way of trying to figure out what the effects or what the relations are of interest. So my response is, I don't think that there is a good way of doing a qualitative synthesis of quantitative data. So you're either going to do a synthesis or you're not, and if you're going to do a synthesis, my argument is that it ought to be a meta-analysis.
Even if you have maybe 6 studies, and 2 of them are GPA,
Mm-hmm.
one of them is homework, and another one is math.
Right. So in that case, what I would do is I would present a table. And I would have the author's names in one column and a description of the intervention in another column, description of the sample in another column, the outcome that was measured, and an effect size with a confidence interval for all the studies. And that's where I would stop. I would not try to come up with any sort of summary conclusion. I would just say the data don't support it at this point. That's deeply unsatisfying. And that's why people say overall they seem to suggest. Right, but that's a dangerous bridge to cross. Yes?
So does that mean that performing a meta-analysis, that's basically the gold standard? If you can't do that, then it's really no good. In terms of saying who person can see relationships done, and a true meta-analysis is irrelevant.
So I would say that I don't know of any synthesis techniques for quantitative data that don't involve meta-analysis that meet my goals of transparency and rigor. How about that? I'm loath to call it a gold standard. And honestly, the reason I want to call it a gold standard is that in many practical uses, meta-analysis is imperfect and maybe even wildly imperfect. It's not that it's a panacea. It's that it's better than the alternatives. That's the main issue. It's not that it's always going to be great. You may not, often may not have the sample sizes required to make confident judgments, whatever. But it's better than doing some of the other synthesis techniques. So if you're going to do a synthesis, my argument is you ought to do a meta-analysis. If you are not going to synthesize, then figure out ways of presenting the data and making the case that you need more studies and try to inform that conversation of the construction of the next generation of studies as specifically as you can. Yeah?
As the field progresses, I'm thinking of a study that we did at UAO several years ago on cholesterol, the effects of cholesterol-lowering drugs. And there were a series of meta-analyses done, and we arrayed them. And of course, this inclusion and exclusion criteria differed among the authors because some wanted to include drugs that had adverse effects, some
Right.
did not. So you had, the whole entire array of what studies had been done, the array of the meta-analysts who had included or not included, and then you try to make sense of this meta-analysis,
Right.
basically. So
Right.
as this field progresses, I mean, you're going to have more of that kind of issue to deal with, right?
Yeah, I think so. So this relates to work I alluded to earlier. So we did a review of reviews of after-school programs. And that is, it's not an easy thing to do, but I think you'll start to see more of those, sort of meta-syntheses. So yes. What else? One more.
What about the problem of having very valuable interventions that are hard to quantify in terms of their results? So is it good enough to have a result that was positive but unclear in terms of statistical change to include in systematic review, or is it should an analysis or should a study that's included in the review be as statistically analytical as the meta-analysis which you're doing yourself?
I'm not sure I understand the question, so let me rephrase and you can tell me if I have.
Yeah, basically what my colleague and I, Steve, are working on is in the development field, we're looking at land rights in developing countries. There's a lot of very informal practices and a lot of it's not on day one there was a change which can be measured against that of day two.
Right. Yeah, I think that you're in a hard situation there, but I also think you're asking me a value judgment. And I think as a policymaker, it's that person or maybe the people living in the community that have to make the judgment about the trade-off between how useful the information seems versus how rigorous it seems. A lot of real-world data are messy, and there's never been a perfect experiment. So everything is imperfect. It's just how much imperfection are you willing to tolerate? And I don't think there's an answer to that question, unfortunately. People vary.
That's reassuring.
Okay. I'm glad I came up with the right answer. Well, everybody, thank you very much. I appreciate the questions. I'll be around, so let us thank you.